They called it the Night of Crowns and Blood. Behind the jeweled curtains of every medieval royal bedchamber, law and lust intertwined until neither could be separated from power. The flicker of candles on silk revealed a terror rarely spoken aloud, that a queen's worth began and could end beneath the canopy of her wedding bed. It wasn't simply the fear of the man beside her, nor the pain that came with the consummation. It was the witnesses, the clerics, the courtiers, the ladies who listened beyond the drapes to ensure the moans were proof of a lawful union. One wrong whisper, one moment of silence, and an empire could unravel. The wedding night was not private, it was a ritual of state, a performance in flesh. By morning, the queen's body would be evidence, and history would record whether she had served her duty or betrayed it. To be crowned was to be consumed. In the courts of Europe, from France to Castile to the cold halls of England, a royal marriage was never only about love. It was an act of empire, the binding of two dynasties in flesh and faith. The church demanded proof, the realm demanded heirs, and the queen, however unwilling, was both vessel and witness to her own erasure. Chroniclers described wedding nights like trials, where a young woman's innocence was weighed against her duty to birth power. If she bled, she was pure. If she did not, she was accused of deceit or witchcraft. The marriage could be annulled, alliances undone, wars ignited. By the end of this story, you will see why one queen's trembling beneath candlelight was not a matter of desire but survival. For in that single night, the line between sanctity and violence blurred so completely that even God's law slept in the bedchamber. The ritual began long before the bride entered the bed. In the 13th century, queens were examined by matrons to ensure virginity, a grotesque blend of medicine and voyeurism. The women, often strangers from the groom's court, lifted linens and whispered judgments that could decide nations. One false report could cost lives. Imagine the cold, airless silence of those chambers as hands pried, candles hissed, and reputation was carved in whispers. For a royal bride, even the word untouched became currency. The most powerful queens in history, Isabella of France, Margaret of Denmark, Catherine of Aragon, learned that purity was not virtue, but proof of obedience. When the wedding procession ended, the queen was led through corridors lit by wax torches. The scent of myrrh and sweat mingled as the crowd followed, half in celebration, half in hunger for spectacle. She would disrobe under silk sheets as priests chanted blessings at the threshold. In some kingdoms, the entire court escorted the couple to the bed, lifted the canopy, and watched them lie down together before withdrawing to drink and jest. The royal body was not her own, it was the seal of treaty, the parchment of alliance, the altar of state. The first whisk came not from cruelty, but from custom. Consummation was a legal act. Without it, the marriage could not exist. The law literally slept between husband and wife. Annulment's deadly weapons of politics rested on whether a queen could prove the act had taken place. In England, kings like Henry VIII used that loophole to reshape the world. But centuries before him, queens already knew their most private moment could destroy them in public. One night in 1314, in the French court, Queen Margaret of Burgundy found her doom sealed not by sin, but by suspicion. Rumors of adultery spread when the king's spies claimed her lover entered her bedchamber. Her undergarments were used as evidence, her body interrogated for marks of betrayal. She was imprisoned, her title stripped, her name blackened by the very law meant to protect her chastity. And so, every queen who came after feared that night, not for its intimacy, but for its witnesses. A tear in the sheet could mean scandal. A stain of blood could mean safety. The paradox was cruel. Pain proved virtue, while pleasure proved guilt. The act of love became a crime seen by the late Middle Ages. The church had woven itself deep into the marriage bed. Bishops wrote that consummation was not only permitted but holy labor. Manuals for confessors listed questions to intimate for even the most devout ears. Was the act completed? Was it with intention to conceive? Had the wife resisted? A sin could be annulled, but an unconsummated marriage could not stand. Thus, the bed became a courtroom, and the queen its reluctant witness. Consider the case of Catherine of Aragon, sent from Spain to England to wed Prince Arthur in 1501. Barely 16, she crossed the sea carrying a dowry large enough to feed kingdoms. The night of her marriage was watched with almost superstitious attention. But Arthur died within months, and when his brother Henry later sought to marry her, Rome demanded proof. Had she lain with Arthur? Her entire queenship, and the future of England, hinged on a question whispered behind closed curtains decades earlier. She swore she was untouched. Henry swore she lied. The result was schism, reformation, and the death of a faith united for 1,000 years. It was not just England. In Castile, witnesses signed royal certificates of consummation, attesting they had heard sounds of joy. In Scotland, the bedding ceremony was performed in public halls. Courtiers tossed shoes at the bed, laughing as the royal couple disappeared beneath the covers. But laughter was the language of fear. Every jest masked the truth that a kingdom's legitimacy depended on what the people did or did not do in that flickering dark. The midpoint of this chronicle lies in the horror of knowing that queens could never speak of their terror. Letters burned, physicians silenced. What remained were rumors. Chroniclers described trembling brides as if they were relics. One English monk wrote of a royal bride pale as altar wax, eyes lifted in supplication. Another described a queen's sheets carried through the corridors as proof of consummation, blood still wet beneath embroidered gold. And yet, the deeper one looks into these rituals, the more the sacred and profane blur together. For every priest who blessed the bed, there was a lawyer ready to void its sanctity. For every marriage declared divine, another was declared null, based on anatomy and gossip. The wedding night was no union, it was a gamble played with bodies as dice. Here lies the darkest truth. The queen's first night was not hers to live. It belonged to witnesses, priests, and lawmakers who made her body the border between kingdoms. The church's doctrine declared that the marriage bed was sanctified only through the wife's submission. Any refusal could be deemed heresy. To resist was to defy divine order. And so, the ritual became a slow erasure of old dot in France. King Philip IV's daughters-in-law became the center of the most scandalous trial of the 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair. Accused of adultery, the women were humiliated before the court. Their lovers were flayed alive, their bodies broken on wheels, their faces turned to the castles where queens once wept. Margaret of Burgundy was strangled in secret. Her supposed crimes began with whispers from her bedchamber. The law had entered that room, and it would not leave until blood had been spilled. The same pattern echoed across centuries. In Hungary, Queen Gertrude was murdered by nobles who accused her of manipulating the king through lust. In England, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed by gossip of her boldness on her wedding night. Historians now believe those rumors were crafted by men seeking her downfall, but at the time, the image of a queen unrestrained in bed was enough to call her unnatural, demonic. Deserving of death, each case bore the same signature. What was private became evidence. What was sacred became political. Queens lived under a paradox of expectation, chaste before the wedding, fertile after. But nature itself defied such control. Barrenness was not a sin, yet it was treated as treason. When wombs failed, kingdoms trembled. The most haunting example comes from Catherine de' Medici. On her wedding night to the French heir Henry, witnesses waited outside the door, counting hours. When dawn came and no word emerged, the court murmured that the marriage was cursed. For years, Catherine's inability to bear children was blamed on that silent night. She became a figure of suspicion, accused of sorcery, poison, and the black arts. It took a decade and multiple mistresses to prove the king, not the queen, was at fault. But by then, the myth had rooted. Even centuries later, her image remained shadowed by that first night's silence. Here, the law became theater. Marriage contracts described the physical act with legal precision. Canon lawyers debated how long a husband must try before declaring a union void. Some prescribed weeks, others years. The language of scripture twisted into a ledger of flesh. Every candle in those bedchambers burned on both ends, one for the bride, one for the crown. The aftermath of those nights echoed through centuries of lineage and law. Queens who survived their wedding night often carried its scars in silence. Some turned their fear into power. Elizabeth of Hungary devoted her life to charity, claiming her bed had been a place of trial, not love. Others like Isabella of France turned against their husbands, leading rebellions that shook entire kingdoms. Behind their rage lay something older than politics, the memory of violations sanctified by law. The church eventually softened its public oversight of the marriage bed, but the damage had been done. The doctrine of marital debt, the belief that a wife owed her body whenever her husband demanded, remained for centuries. The queen's fear had become every woman's inheritance. Even as monarchies faded, the echoes persisted in legal codes and moral expectations. The idea that legitimacy, inheritance, and divine favor were tied to a woman's body shaped Europe's destiny. In dusty archives, one finds royal letters written in trembling Latin, confessing not love, but dread. One queen wrote that she trembled to meet the law in the flesh. Another thanked God that her husband was too ill to consummate, sparing her the ritual scrutiny. These were not confessions of prudery, but of survival. Each woman who endured that night became both symbol and prisoner. Her silence the mortar of empire. When revolutions came, when thrones fell and guillotines rose, the symbolism of the queen's bed returned one final time. In France, Marie Antoinette's trial dragged her motherhood, her fertility, her supposed promiscuity into public shame. The crowd that cheered her execution was not only killing a monarch, they were exercising centuries of domination wrapped in satin and scripture. Thus ended the age of the sacred bedchamber. Yet, in museums, the marriage contracts still rest behind glass. Their ink faded but their cruelty intact. They remind us that for hundreds of years, power was consummated not in council halls, but in candlelight. History remembers kings for their conquest, but queens those crowned at sunset and broken by dawn carried a different kind of crown, invisible, unbearable, and eternal. The medieval wedding night was not romance, nor ceremony. It was the courtroom of flesh where kingdoms rose and women vanished. Beneath the lace and incense, beneath the vows and hymns, lay a truth that empires dared not name, that sovereignty itself once slept in fear. And when the candles died, so, to did innocence. Next time, we open another forbidden page, the monk who killed a saint, secrets of the Abbey of Shadows.